James Day, public television pioneer and chairman of the CUNY TV Advisory Board, passed away in April 2008. His legacy includes the series Day at Night, which aired for 130 episodes beginning in 1973. The program features interviews with many of the great thinkers and achievers of the 20th century. These 30-year-old programs have been restored. The interviews remain fresh and relevant today, exploring issues that are still important to society. Showing them again is CUNY TV's tribute to Jim and his contributions to public television.
Vincent Price is an actor, no doubt about that. For more than 35 years, he's been a frequent and familiar performer on the stage and in the movies, usually in the starring role. But there can be and is doubt about whether he uses acting simply as a means of supporting his expensive habit, the habit of pursuing and collecting art treasures wherever he finds them. His love affair with the art world began before he started acting and has been with him since, dominating his thoughts and energies, revealing him as an art connoisseur and collector of some distinction. He wrote about his love affair with art in a visual autobiography entitled I Like What I Know. More recently, his efforts have turned toward another art, that of cuisine, having collaborated with his wife on several books on that subject, the latest of which is the Vincent and Mary Price Cookbook. Mr. Price, the skill of appreciating art is really a process of learning to see, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
How do you learn to see?
Well, I think it takes a little effort.
Does it?
Yes.
It isn't something we're born with,
no,
obviously.
definitely not. I think that Americans particularly are very oriented to hearing because radio gave us a marvelous musical education over the years. Toscanini and the Met, the Saturday Met. And Damrosch, all of those things, children's education in music. But television has never given us any education in the visual arts, which...
I wonder why.
Well, because it isn't commercial, and they just never did it. You know, I've done quite a few films for television on art, and they've always been enormously popular, but nobody's ever sort of gone along and said, look, here's... the money to go ahead and produce a whole series of them. I think they would still be enormously popular.
How would you do them? How would you teach people to see through television?
Well, I would do it mainly through what is in America. I think that one of the things that an awful lot of people don't realize in America, that we really have probably the greatest concentration of art that any nation has ever had because of plundering and buying and stealing and all the ordinary ways that every other country got them. But our museums are so rich. I would go around to all the museums in America and just show what's in them. Places like the Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is an absolutely unparalleled collection of Western art.
So it's partly a matter of simple exposure
yes,
to
it would.
Good art?
Absolutely, because once you learn to see and once you are told that the human eye has changed in the last 100 years, and we don't see things the same way.
It has
anymore.
changed?
Oh, absolutely.
In what way?
Well, because the photograph was invented, which freed the artist from the necessity of dealing with reality, and the airplane gave him a look at the world abstractly. The astronauts certainly gave us pictures that will influence art enormously, I'm sure.
Just by standing off?
Just by standing off and looking back at something. Made me feel very puny, I must say.
Were you taught to see when you were a child? You grew up in St. Louis.
Yes, I was. We had a very good museum in St. Louis. And
when did you first become acquainted with the museum?
Well, I went to what it was at that point laughingly called a progressive school. In other words, you didn't learn anything, but you learned a lot. It was very hard to get out of that school into another one. But at the same time, I think it was a marvelous education because we were really educated in the libraries, in the museums, and we were taught to see and to read interesting things, to experience theatrical performances and to do them ourselves. It was a very modern thing at that time. And we had this fine museum, and that was what taught me to see. I was more interested in seeing, I think, than any other of the senses.
You grew up in what you've described in your book as a well-to-do family.
Yes.
Which you've distinguished from a well-off family.
Yes, they're very
What
much.
is that distinction?
Well, I think well-to-do means that you're sort of comfortable. You know, you aren't rich. You aren't in that awfully embarrassing position of having to keep up with anyone. My father was a very successful businessman, but not a rich one, because he believed in reinvesting in the people that worked for him, and a great many. He was a very advanced man, actually, for his time.
Was your house filled with art?
No, it was not filled with art at all.
So you weren't introduced in the home to art?
No, it was something that I missed very much. But
How could you miss it if you didn't know it?
because it was all around me. We lived very near the museum, which was in the park, and across the street from Washington University, that had a very fine art department. It was all around me, but it was not one of those things that Mother and Dad ever thought of investing in. The pictures in our house were really abysmal. There was a glorious etching that somebody had given Mother that she hated but had to hang, you know, of 4 cows in a pasture. That's about the extent of our art.
You did have music in the home.
Yes, tremendous amount of music.
But that
because,
didn't really take with you, I suppose.
no, because my brother and my sisters were all very talented at it, and I wasn't. And I just was more interested in seeing than in hearing.
You, as a youngster, I gather, associated with people in St. Louis who shared your same enthusiasm for these artistic ventures.
Yes, very much. It was.
Where did you find these people?
Well, they were wonderful families of people. There was the O'Neill family, Barbara O'Neill, who was an actress who I later worked with when she became an actress, and her family were very interested in the theater. Her father was an amateur poet. Their friends were people like Rachel Lindsay and Sarah Teasdale and some of the best American poets. And because I knew them, I was introduced to a whole world of art. Were
they regarded as unconventional?
They were regarded as rather bohemian.
Were they?
Yes.
How did your parents feel about your association?
Well, they liked them, you see. So
it was all right.
They were very, very well placed people in the society of St. Louis. So you might have looked down on them a little bit, but at the same time you looked up to them because they achieved a great deal.
You had an interest in going to Europe at a very early age that grew out of this.
Yes,
art.
Out of that, and the thing of being in the museum and really wanting to see firsthand the art of America, the art of Europe. And
this wasn't firsthand art in the museum?
Well, there were an awful lot of casts at that point. You know, it was filled with it, and the museum grew and is now a major museum in America. But I remember that the Verrocchio statue was in the foyer, and now it's I can't remember, but now it's, you know, an original by somebody or other, Carl Millis or something. But it was just a desire to see that material firsthand. And I had a little bit of money that from working, you know, selling magazines and things like that. My grandmother left me a little, and I took off on one of those see Europe in 3 days trips. I had a marvelous
an organized tour.
Yes, yeah.
What was the reaction? You were 16 years old at the time. What was your reaction of a 16-year-old boy being exposed on his own in an organized tour to all the things you'd been thinking about for 2 or 3 years?
All my life, really. Up to that point, I had wanted to see art and to see. I believe that the whole history of man is best represented by his creative ability. And it was just fascinating. I mean, I had all the books I wanted to read.
You weren't disappointed?
Not at all. No, I was flabbergasted, as a matter of fact, and it changed my life, that trip. I went back to Europe and many times after that and studied in England, and I was going to be an art historian. And I guess in a way I still am somewhat, because as an amateur in the arts, a lover of the arts in the French sense.
How did it change your life, other than directing you even more strongly toward art?
That was the main way. I think probably I might have been seduced into business had I not taken that trip. But once I saw that man could create in this extraordinary way, and also the theater in England, for instance, and the opera in, you know, Milan, places, it changed my whole life. I mean, I knew that that's what I wanted to be. I wanted to be in the arts.
Were you seducible in the business?
Not very much so. No, I think I would have been a disastrous businessman. It was probably just as well for American business that I didn't go in it. But I think my father, who was successful in business, really would like to have done other things too, but it wasn't done at that
When did you
time.
first begin to suspect that might be the case?
He-
Many years later?
Well, we became very good friends. I was the last of 4 children, and I had the good fortune of making friends of my parents rather than just parents of my parents. And my mother had a leaning towards the arts, and my father appreciated them and enjoyed them, particularly the theater. And everything came to St. Louis, all the best plays, and I was always taken to see them. Being the youngest child, I was really pampered a little bit in
Yes.
that way, which I liked, and of course I adored it. So,
You began collecting at the age of 12.
yeah. Well, it was kind of just one of those things. I had read so many books on art, and one day I walked into a little art store downtown St. Louis, which was mainly a framing place, and they were having an exhibition of Rembrandt etchings. And there was one that really took my fancy, and I said, "How much is it?" And the man said, "It's $37.50. Well, I had $5 in my pocket, and so I said, "Could I put that down on it?" And he said yes. I think he knew my father was good for the other $32.50.
Your credit rating was high at
Was
that
all
point.
right. But anyway, I paid for it myself, and from it I learned a tremendous amount about the importance of the ownership of art, the importance of buying a recording, of owning a work of art so that you could study it and live with it and make it really your own rather than just a thing that you pick up at a cursory glance in a museum. And it lasted all my life.
Is that Rembrandt etching still in your collection?
The Rembrandt etching unfortunately left my collection
It did.
at one period of being broke. Many things have come in and out, but I think you should change.
Did you sell it at many, many times its original
Not really.
value of $37.50?
No, not really. I sold it at a time when I should have held on to it, because today all of Rembrandt's etchings are worth enormous prices.
Yes. You apparently were destined always to be a Yale man.
Yes. Funny thing, my daughter the other day, I said, she's be 12 tomorrow, as a matter of fact, and she said, I said, what would you like to do, in education? She said, I want to go to Yale. And I said, but you can't do that. That's a men's college. completely, that
Yes.
dates me. But she wants to go to Yale. And I wanted to go to Yale, too.
Why?
Well, because my father went there, and my brother went there, and my brother-in-law went there, and it was just sort of one of those things that I wanted to do very much. I'm glad I did, because Yale was a very expanding experience. It was during the Depression, so that it wasn't all that easy. It wasn't quite as sort of lackadaisical as some college educations are. We all had to really work to stay in. And it's a marvelous college.
What were your interests when you were at college?
Well, I majored in English because they didn't have a major in history of art at that time, but I did well enough to get some chance to take courses that I wanted to. And so my last 2 years, I really concentrated on the history of art and history of religion. And those were sort of my main interests.
And you left Yale and continued your studies in art,
Yes, at the
In-
Courtauld Institute
in
London.
London.
Yes, which is a marvelous place.
determined to be an art historian?
Yes, determined to be an art historian, except that when I got there, I went to the theater every night that I
Oh.
could. And I didn't have very much money, but the theater was very cheap in those days. You could stand in line and get whatever seats were left, which is a marvelous system, because you always had a full house. And I fell in love with the theater. It's very easy to do in London at any time.
Is that when it began?
That's when it began. I had done some amateur plays and things, and I loved the theater, but I think everybody does, really.
And you hadn't thought of yourself as an actor up to that point,
No,
really?
not really, not really. I taught school for a year after I got out of Yale, and I directed some little plays and things, and played in some local sort of shows out in Riverdale, and decided I liked it very much. And so my second play in London in a little private theater was Lawrence Houseman's Victoria Regina.
And you played
Prince Albert, yes.
one of the leads in that.
Yes, and then when...
As your second play, your first
Yes.
play was a bit part.
Yes, it was a bit part, but
What
it was
happened?
extraordinary.
That's an enormous...
I don't know, it just worked, you know. It was one of those silly breaks, and then Helen Hayes bought it, and I came along with it.
And starred
and
on
started
Broadway
at 23, which is kind of
at the
exciting.
age of 23.
Yeah. It's been up and down ever since.
Did you feel natural, comfortable on the stage?
Yes, completely at home, and still do. I have all the terrors that most people have, but at the same time, I think that the freedom of expression that the theater allows, and movies too, not so much television, but television drama, I mean, because it's now, it used to when it was live television, but not anymore, because it's now just a short movie that you're doing. But the theater is a place where you can express yourself and be free and be rid of yourself in a way. It's a great catharsis.
Be rid of yourself and
Yes.
hiding behind the mask.
In hiding in the
drama.
character that you're doing, though you're always the same person, obviously, you know, I mean, nobody really hides completely. But it's a wonderful experience, I think, theater. It's a great catharsis. And of course, the theater opens up so many other roads for you. Your life is so much richer because you are an actor. I mean, people are glad to see you. And I've been in places where somebody say, oh, you're interested in art, aren't you? And you're the actor. Well, come on with me. And they'll take me to see things that other people wouldn't get to see. So I've had a marvelous visual experience from a very visual medium, which is the theater.
With no formal training?
No, I had none. No, I had no formal training in the theater at all. The Yale Drama School was very famous, but at the time that I was at Yale, I found it a little precious. And actually, most of the people who've come out of it have not been actors, they've been designers and writers. And so I just decided not to do that. As a matter of fact, I was in the Glee Club and sang. And I think singing is a marvelous mode of expression, too.
I think you say in your book that you went into the Glee Club because you had to have an extrovert activity.
Yes.
You were an extroverted person.
Very much so. Very much so. Still am.
Is acting intuitive? Is it something that, as you say, simply a means of expression? I can't imagine myself stepping onto a stage, for example.
No,
And
and
certainly not in becoming
Yeah.
a lead actor in my second performance.
I think, you know, that to want to be an actor is an extraordinary privilege in a way, but it also requires a tremendous amount of discipline. It requires the kind of discipline that all the arts require, the discipline to survive and to last in it. I never wanted to just do Victoria Regina and then disappear. And I know an awful lot of people thought, well, you can't have a break like that when you're 23 and survive in the business. Well, I've been in it pretty near 40 years now. And it's my whole life. I can't think of any other way of life.
What happened after you starred on Broadway for 2 years?
Well, I did one play that was a terrible flop, the next one, and then I joined the Mercury Theater with Orson Welles, which was a tremendous success, and came back and did a play called Angel Street, which was another great success.
That was just at the beginning of the war, wasn't it?
Yes, yes.
And it was then that you came to Hollywood for your first successful movie.
Well, I came out and did one that wasn't too successful, and then came back out after Angel Street and played some good villains. And it was an interesting time. I think that the whole mood of Hollywood was just changing then, and I'm glad that I was here during the 4 or 5 years before it completely changed into a sort of pseudo-realism that I think it's still in. It was a land of make-believe, and it was very exciting. The glamorous women, the mysterious stars, the people that I met at that time and that got to know and work with are still to me fabled creatures. Ronald Colman and Joan Crawford and people like that. They're fabulous people. They're bigger than life. I think a lot of actors today are smaller than life.
Did you learn from them as you played with them and went along in the movies, or did you play with them?
Yes, as a matter of fact, one time when I came out and did my first movie and I saw myself on the screen and I realized that I was too big, too broad, too theatrical. And I went to a woman who was a very famous teacher in New York. She taught everybody, called Laura Elliott. And she sent me to see every movie that Ronald Colman had ever done, and Charles Boyer, both of whom became great friends of mine later on. And I did Ronnie's last 2 pictures with him and toured with Charles Boyer.
In the Don Juan in Hell.
Yes, Don Juan.
Hardwick and
yeah. Agnes
That
Moorehead.
must have been a particular satisfaction to
Terribly
you.
exciting.
You mentioned playing the role of good villains, as though there was something particularly juicy about a good villainous part for you.
There is, because the villain has so many sides. I do a lecture around the country. I've been a lecturer for about 20 years now, and I do a lecture now on the history of villainy. They're always the best parts, you know. It's that marvelous thing of Gene Kerr's, the snake has all the lines, you know. Adam and Eve just stand there, but the snake's got all the lines. And the villain is usually such a many-faceted character. He's a very interesting person to study. There are all kinds of villains. There's the villain that is a villain in spite of himself. There is the villain who is a born villain, I mean, the kind who sort of were born that way. And then there are villains that are the most interesting ones, I think, who are turned to evil by fate, really, by the wounds, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune.
Is this what led you into playing in horror movies, or is that a totally different kind of
Well,
thing?
you know, none of us who were in those films, Boris Karloff and Peter Lorre and Basil Rathbone, and all of us that have been in them, really think of them as horror films. I think of a horror film as a film that really frightens me about everyday life. The stories of violence, the stories of gangsterism in the old days.
Clockwork Orange, that kind
That's
of...
right, yes, I think of that. Because most of the stories that I've done have been based on the tales by de Maupassant and Edgar Allan Poe and Hawthorne and things like that. And they're really classic kind of Gothic tales. And I think Boris felt that way too. I mean, certainly Frankenstein was one of the great novels of its time. You know.
What are the satisfactions to the actor in playing in these kinds of movies?
Well, your problem is very different from that of the realist actor, because you have to make the unbelievable believable. And the other actor, the Marlon Brando, has to make the believable believable. So you have an added dimension, an added challenge as an actor.
How do you account for the popularity of these kinds of films in recent years?
Well, I heard a kid today talking at UCLA, they're doing some kind of a spook thing, and he said it turns you on, you get a high, the adrenaline goes shooting up. Well, it's true, you know, I mean, the reaction of the audience to The Exorcist is absolutely extraordinary. And I've gone to see some of the Poe pictures that I've done, and the kids just love them, you know, and so do the adults. There is a charge. It's the same charge you get out of a nursery story, isn't it, of a fairy tale.
Do you see some of your earlier movies on TV?
As seldom as I possibly can.
Why?
Well, they're kind of depressing, actually, because in the first place, I watched one the other night that I'd never seen. And I thought it'd be kind of fun to see it. And I watched it, and suddenly I realized that everybody in it was dead but me. And it was terrifying. It was really terrifying, because there they were, alive and vital and exciting. They were all gone. They were all people much older than myself, fortunately.
Yes.
But it was very depressing.
What happened when you turned from art history to drama? What happened to your interest in art history? Did you attempt to be an artist at any time?
No, you mean a practicing artist.
Yes.
I studied it. And I was one of those fortunate people who realized that I had no talent. And so I'm not a Sunday painter or a Monday painter or anything else. I just
But
do
you
not
stayed,
have
of
any.
course, with collecting. You've said if you've
Yes.
had any credo or philosophy of life, it is in collecting and possessing this
Yes,
art.
collecting, but for study. I've written several books on art and a lot of articles on art. I had a syndicated column for a while, and I wrote a book on American art last year called A Treasury of American Art, which goes from the beginning up till now, which was fascinating during the research, because I had never really realized the extraordinary seriousness of the American artist to identify with this new country. It's been the sort of main purpose of the artist, was how can I be an American? How can I stop being Oriental or German or Polish or whatever they were, what their backgrounds were, and be American? And it really was a challenge studying this. I was fascinated by American art.
When you collect art, when you're collecting a Rembrandt or one of the famous old masters, it's obvious that it's good art.
Yes.
History has told you
That is not my case,
Yes.
however.
What if you walk into an artist you never heard of, never seen before? How do you know it's good art? How do you measure whether it's good
Well,
art or not?
a few years ago, I ran the art department for Sears Roebuck and bought 55,000 works
Yes, I
of
read
art.
about that.
So I've seen a little art in my
Just
day.
experience has taught you something.
Yes, and I see something that appeals to me. I see an honesty, an integrity, a newness of vision. I've been very fortunate, actually, in being in on some of the people who have become very famous artists. Andrew Wyeth, I bought a watercolor of his when he was 19 years old. And Jackson Pollock and people like this who could not be more divergent in their approach to art, but both of whom had a force and an integrity and a rightness for their time. Art is nothing more than the visual report of the time in which it's done. And if you look at it that way, then you've got to know something about the time in which it's been done. And I'm very interested in my time, though I am an art historian. I think history is only good if it leads you into the directions of your own time.
And much of the art today is criticized by people who don't know much about art as a kind of a put-on. You don't think that it's a put-on.
But they never stop to think of what the time they're living in is. You know, they want a painting of a piano with a Spanish shawl over it and a vase of zinnias, you know. But that isn't our time. Our time is a time of brutality, of anxiousness, of uncertainty, and the artist reflects this, a man like Jackson Pollock, who allows the accident to happen, who allows a picture to have a life of its own, as he said.
How do you feel about the exchange, the sale of pictures today for fantastic prices, from which the artist himself gets nothing?
Well, there would hardly be a way for Van Gogh to get anything.
That's
and,
true.
you know, after all, the family did own all the pictures and did sell some and made vast fortune out of it. And not all artists have starved by a long shot. Andrew Wyeth is a very rich and very successful man. We prefer to think of the starving artist. I think he makes a better story than the successful one. But to me, this whole thing of the incredible prices of art, if you look historically back on it, it's happened many times before, that in times of uncertainty, people invest in things. And they invest in diamonds, which is ridiculous, actually. But the biggest investment in the world, I suppose, the most sort of thing that loses less value as time goes on, is a great work of art.
But it has a value to you quite beyond its investment value.
And fortunately, most of those high prices are paid by people who are going to eventually give them to the public. And that's very important.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.